heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 252, covering the week of March 8th through March 12th, 2021. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Facebook page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. You can find all those social media accounts at our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. That's ABBEVILLE, institute.org. While you're there, give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook exploring the Southern tradition by 20 Abbeville Institute scholars. You'll get on our email list. We'll send you an email 5 days a week, typically, that relates back to the material we published that week. It's called the Daily Dose of Dixie. You can also click on that support tab while you're at abbevilleinstitute.org. You can make a monthly, annually, or a one-time gift to the Institute. We exist on your tax-deductible contributions. So if you like what we do, if you like everything, our podcast, our website, our conferences, our videos, all that kind of stuff, our books, click on that support tab and make a donation. You can also click on the shop tab. You can get your Abbeville Institute apparel. So it's high quality and embroidered stuff. If you like the Institute and you want to advertise it, get some of that material. Also, download our free mobile app, free of charge. This is something else that your donation helps contribute to. Free of charge, you can have the Abbeville Institute on the go. Just go to your app store, look for Abbeville Institute, and you can download it. You get our podcast, our lectures, all kinds of cool stuff through that. It's a wonderful way to ensure that the Institute is around you at all times, and that's what we want. All right. Well, let's talk about the material for the week. We had a really great week this week, I think, and it's one of my favorite weeks of the year. And I want to start with this piece that we published on Wednesday by Jason Morgan. And this is a positive piece at a time when things seem very dark. And it's a short piece, so I want to read it because it's so good. Jason Morgan is just a great writer. And when things are looking bleak, which they are, he's saying, no, this is a good time to be Southern. So I want to read this because, again, it's very positive. These past several years, we Americans have been living in an accelerating anti-cultural vortex. Day by day, the Yankee juggernaut gains steam. Once content with carpet-bombing Hanoi and Baghdad, the Yankees are now taking their civilizational demolition derby back south, where it all began. Topple the Southern statues, spray paint the Southern monuments, mock the Southern accents and folkways, and cancel Southern history and culture from Hoppin' John's soup to pine nuts. You may have heard once or twice over the past few years that everyone except Yankees is a racist. Doubly so for Southerners. Even Georgia native Clarence Thomas got canceled during Black History Month for being too Southern for Yankee sensibilities to handle. I have no doubt that the Yankees will cancel Booker T. Washington and Sweet Tea next. The former was ornery enough to reject perpetual victimhood by insisting that someone could rise up from slavery, after all, and the latter, alas, contains neither kale nor tofu. Things may seem bleak. What with the Yankees riding high on their horse and issuing cancel edicts left and right, well, only right, against anyone who dares question their self-righteous caterwauling. It would appear that the Yankee has won the field in the whole tournament, that the United States has been given wholly over to a screeching army of Karens hell-bent on turning all the world to Lincolnville, kind of like Potterville, but with more drive-by shootings. The Yankees have us masked up, afraid to go outside, demoralized from voting, ashamed to pronounce Winda and Tamara, properly as spelled, and resigned to living forever under the boot of ideological overlords who can't tell the difference between a man and a woman or between a real civilization and a hierarchy of hatred for one's fellow human beings. A bad time to be from the South, all in all. We are hemmed in at the mercy of the godless Yankee. It is Vicksburg all over again, only this time the Yankees are congratulating themselves for their victory on CNN. But no, that's not how I see things. I've been thinking lately that there is no better time than now to be a Southerner. My scrawny chest swells with pride when I see our flag flying high. I call to mind the past, and I am glad at heart to be who I am. By the grace of God, I have a culture. I share deep well springs of belonging and understanding with my brothers and sisters of the South. Those are the things that make us human, the bonds that lash us to one another, whether we like it or not. I have a people, a background, take it or leave it. And please leave the pecan pie for me. I was born a Southerner and will be happy to die as one someday. It's the lack of the human welter of connections and forbearances that makes the Yankee into a screaming devil. The Yankee is a pitiful creature, a sad sack nobody whose only mode of communication is the propaganda crusade, the drone strike, and the atom bomb. Lately, he has branched out to the media and of the throne brick and the bullhorn. The Yankee is the loneliest of all human beings, for unlike everyone else, the Yankee has no culture to call his own, no home to return to. He holds nothing sacred except his own hypocrisy and is therefore doomed to roam the earth, destroying what all of the men and women hold dear: kinfolk, tradition, a little plot of ground in which one's ancestors have been laid to rest. The Yankee can never have these things, can never know what it is to be raised in an actual culture connecting the individual to the past, the present, and somehow to others yet to be born. The Yankee is raging around the planet like a lovelorn King Kong, insisting in his heartache that everyone pay homage to 72 genders and quit reading Green Eggs and Ham. How sorrowful it must be to hate the world so, to have no humor in one's heart and no companion but one's anti-human ideology. I wince when I see the Yankee rear up and bellow, pulling a train of death and destruction behind him from Yemen to Guatemala. A tear rolls down my cheek almost when I witness the anti-cultural monsters streaming out of their Bostons and New Yorks, out of our illegally occupied Washington, D.C., pretending to make friends with the world by selling boatloads of missiles to dictators. It tears at the breast to see someone degrade himself so. There is no one more pitiable than the Yankee, holding us all at gunpoint, demanding to be loved. Now, when we need culture and breeding the most, seeing so plainly that the Yankee has neither, let us give thanks that we were born and raised to live like ladies and gentlemen. I have never been so grateful as I am this very day to be from Louisiana, by the way of Alabama and Tennessee. We are universally loathed by the Yankee as barefoot, illiterate, gap-toothed racists. God bless America. To be disdained by a Yankee is a gift from God. And bless the Yankee heart, because he just doesn't know what it is to have a place in the world. Let this little missive by candlelight in the dark to my fellow Southerners. We are perfectly positioned to survive the collapse of Yankeedom, which we see accelerating day by day right before our eyes. There's never been a better time than right now to be a Southerner. What a great piece. Again, looking at the bad and turning it into a positive. And when you look at the material we published this week, I think that's a great theme for it. Tom Daniels' piece on Monday sparked a lot of conversation because you read in Time magazine that during World War II, you had a whole bunch of German POWs in the United States. And these German POWs were supposedly being treated better than black Southerners. Now, Tom Daniel grew up in Tuskegee. He's written several articles about this for the Abbeville Institute. And he says, look, I don't know what it was like everywhere else, but I can tell you in Tuskegee, it wasn't that way. It wasn't that way at all. German prisoners were not allowed in the restaurants or other things where blacks were not allowed. That just wasn't the case. And he says this could be because of the unique situation of Tuskegee, but certainly this was in his experience. Now, he was not born, but he has parents and aunts and uncles and people that were alive and cognizant and things were going on back then. They were old enough to know, and they said, look, this is not the case at all. So you have this fake news that's being published by Time magazine and others that this is the situation, and it's a broad strokes, right? It's just this way throughout the South. There's no deviation from this. This is exactly what was going on, and there's nothing. You can't prove it to the contrary, but of course Tom Daniel does. And now this is mostly anecdotal evidence. You're asking people. Well, people do remember things. And there was a POW camp near Tuskegee. It was in Opelika, Alabama, near Auburn, Alabama. And so you had that. You certainly had a situation where you had German POWs around. There's images of this, right? You had a band there. They were treated fairly well at these POW camps. But certainly, this was a situation that may have been unique to Tuskegee, or it may not have been. I mean, there would need to be more studies in this, but I think it shows one thing very well, that you cannot just generalize about what was happening in the South. It depended on where you were and who you were and at what time you were there. But Southerners are just painted with these broad... I mean, this is what Jason Morgan was pointing out in that piece, that you had Southerners who just described all these horrible ways. They're just this and that, these hayseeds, bucktooth, no teeth, smelly. They just don't know, it's stupid. And that's the way it is. This is the caricature you get of the South. And you can't do that to any other people in the United States and get away with it because you'd be called all kinds of horrible names. But you can do it to Southerners. Even black Southerners get canceled because they're Southerners. You can't have that. Right? Booker T. Washington, which there was a great article about Booker T. Washington by Jack Trotter in the most recent issue of February's issue of Chronicles magazine, not the most recent, February's issue of Chronicles magazine. Great piece on Booker T. Washington there. I wrote about Booker T. Washington in my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Real American Heroes, and I remember when I produced that chapter, Washington and S.B. Fuller, who was also another interesting member of the American entrepreneur, a black American entrepreneur. And but he was not into what you would say, as Morgan pointed out, victimhood, right? It was something else. And so I remember the feedback I got from that. Well, he likes people that just stay in their place. That's not it at all. Booker T. Washington was certainly aware of what was happening around him. And that institution, Tuskegee Institute, dominated Macon County, Alabama. They could vote. They could do whatever they want. I mean, certainly you had local ordinances that would enforce segregation. But Washington voted anytime he wanted to. Now, again, and he controlled parts of the education environment in Macon County. There were some important things happening in Macon County because of Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee Institute. And so it depended on where you were and what time you're talking about as to what was happening in these particular areas. And I think that's the important part, the complexity of all this, that we don't get out of this very vanilla and broad swath look at the South. Top down. You have to go from the bottom up. Now, more than willing to do this oftentimes with other things, but not the South. You can't do that with the South. One of the other great pieces this week is by Casey Chalk. I mean, we just had so many. I think all of them were great this week, but Casey Chalk's A Yankee Who Understood Southerners. It's about the book by Henry James, The Bostonians. There was a movie to this effect in the 1980s, starred Christopher Reeves, right? So, but this book, and as he gets into, I remember we got an email from one of our supporters who said, hey, look, I mean, I love the movie because it was so good. It did all of these things, and it showed the South for what it was. Very interesting look at the South. And it's based on a Mississippi-born Northern transplant, Basil Ransom. It takes place a decade after the end of the Civil War. Though Ransom comes from aristocratic stock, I'm reading from the piece now, like many Southerners, his inheritance was devastated by the war in which he fought as a Confederate officer. His plantation ruined and his fortunes depleted, Ransom tries to reinvent himself as a lawyer in New York City with limited success. James offers a deeply empathetic portrayal of Ransom, both as an individual and as someone who represents a humbled, broken manifestation of American civilization. James writes, he, Ransom, too, had been much bereaved, and moreover, that he had fought and offered his own life, even as if it had not been taken. He had lived to see bitter hours. His family was ruined. They had lost their slaves, their property, their freedom, their friends and relations, their home, had tasted of all of the cruelty of defeat. And this is important because we forget that. I mean, Henry James is writing, and then we'd say, well, these Southerners were just influencing. I think Northerners supremely understood what was happening. It wasn't a Southern creation of what was going on with the post-Reconstruction period, that it was bad. I mean, Northerners looked at it and said, this is bad. We wouldn't want it. We wouldn't want that here in the North. Why are we saying the Southerners have to suffer under this stuff? Now, the novel also acknowledges that a Southerner's love for his region is something difficult to explain to outsiders who themselves are often untethered to a particular place and culture, cannot appreciate the devotion to one's ancestral home. We are told he, Ransom, had a passionate tenderness for his own country and a sense of intimate connection with it, which would have made it impossible for him to take a roomful of Northern fanatics into his confidence, as to read aloud his mother's or his mistress's letters, to be quiet about the Southland, not to touch her with vulgar hands, to leave her alone with her wounds and her memories, not prating in the marketplace either of her troubles or her hopes, but waiting as a man should wait, for the slow process, the sensible beneficence of time. This was the desire of Ransom's heart. So Chalk says, look, this is what he's talked about before, and we've had a lot of great pieces by Casey Chalk in the last year. He says, look, Southerners don't love their home for its hypocrisies and moral failures, but in spite of them, because it is theirs. Like other traditional societies, the South engages in a veneration of the dead and honoring of its culture and intellectual inheritance, stemming largely from the same thinking as Checherson's comment about heedlessly taking down fences. My grandfathers, both buried in Virginia, were accomplished men with serious flaws I hope to avoid. That doesn't mean I take their photos and mementos down and throw them into the garbage. Ransom also has a deliciously playful Southern sense of humor. When one woman asks him if he is ever different, he replies, "Oh yes, when I dine out, I usually carry a 6-shooter and a Bowie knife." A Bowie knife. He frequently uses humility as a means of poking fun and vanity of others, and he alone sees the irony of a northern society that allows young and experienced and hopelessly idealistic people to lecture older generations on such topics as moral progress or romantic love. So this is important because that's what you get out of this. And Casey Chalk says, the great conflict of James's novel is between the Southern conservatism of Ransom and the Northern progressivism of his love interest, the feminist orator Verena Tarrant. Ransom rejects Tarrant's feminist ideology, which is, in its rhetoric and ideological objectives, is surprisingly similar to its contemporary descendant in the 21st century. Ransom finds Tarrant's views not only risible but blinkered. He remarks at one point, the suffering of women is the suffering of all humanity. Do you think any movement is going to stop that? Or all the lectures from now to doomsday? We are born to suffer and to bear it like decent people. And that one sentence, James, through Ransom, reminds us that men and women are nature intended to be allies who complement rather than compete with one another. This is a great piece because it gets into that. Now, James wasn't necessarily always certainly sympathetic with the South, and in his personal writings, he was very critical of the South. But he at least has a general understanding of what the South was. And so when you look at the piece, Yankees 38 VMI 3, it's about what's going on at the Virginia Military Institute, and it's by Forrest Marion. A great piece. Forrest Marion describes the dangerous conditions going on in Richmond now, and 38 Yankee lawyers in Richmond are now confronted by 3 lawyers supporting VMI, and of course the effort to remove Jackson and take down Confederate imagery, all of that stuff from VMI. And you look at what's happening here, and it's the same thing. You have these outsiders coming in saying that these are the things that need to happen. Now, some of these people are, quote-unquote, native Virginians, but they've lost all connection to the past. They've lost all anchoring to that particular thing which they're trying to tear down, and that's the important thing about it. I mean, they've lost it all. So I think it's really interesting that you have this manifestation of these problems in American society, these problems that are being driven by outsiders, busybodies, as C.S. Lewis called them, busybodyism. I mean, this is what you get with Yankees, and I think that's where Jason Morgan, that's why I started with that piece, because he points it out. They have to do something. They have to tear something down. They can't just be happy with things as they are. They have to destroy, because that's the only thing that makes them happy, is to destroy. And they're destroying VMI. 38 lawyers against 3. And Forrest Marion is doing a yeoman service here. He and some other graduates of VMI are doing great work trying to just point out these problems. And of course, we do have a video coming from Phil Lee that's going against the Washington Lee situation, where Lee is being attacked now from Washington Lee by some former, some people that have graduated from the institution, including General Sedgwill, who was a West Point professor, at least at one point, retired now, but Ty Sedgwill. And so I find it amazing that this is a situation we're in. I think Southerners, and I was speaking to a representative from South Carolina the other day, and he said, look, when the Calhoun statue came down in Charleston, when the people who put it there, they deeded it to the city because they didn't conceive that the people of Charleston of all places, would want to take down a statue of John C. Calhoun when they did this in the late 19th century. They couldn't see that far in the future that there might be a situation where Calhoun was so reviled by his own people to take it down. But this is what happened. We don't know what's going to happen 100 years from now. Nobody does. Nobody knows what the situation is going to be 100 years from now. But we do know that these things are going on, and it's because of Yankee busybodyism. And certainly Southerners are getting caught up in this. People that don't, well, we're just going to make these Yankees our allies, and we're going to take all this stuff down. And when you look at the piece from James Rutledge Rush on Friday, where he talks about the effort to remove Andrew Jackson. I mean, this is an interesting piece because Roche is always critical of Jackson. He wrote a piece for the website which still gets a tremendous amount of traffic, Andrew Jackson, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's one of our top-read pieces of all time. And I think it's because it's a concise piece that gets into some of the issues about Jackson's life, and so you get college students and other people looking for a write a paper on Andrew Jackson, they find that piece, which is wonderful because they're going to the Abbeville Institute website. But when you look at this particular piece, and he's also written a very critical essay of Brad Berzer's book on Andrew Jackson, in defense of Jackson. He gives Jackson his due, and he says, look, I hate to defend Andrew Jackson, but in this particular case, I have to because Jackson was at least a Southerner, and so when you're looking at taking him off the $20 bill, could we not have done this differently? Could we not have picked somebody who was better than Harriet Tubman, for example, for the $20 bill? That represents the African-American community. He gives people like Ida Wells, who was perhaps a better representative than Harriet Tubman, who's based largely on a myth, right? Harriet Tubman is largely a myth, but we know Ida Wells was not a myth. Could there not have been a better choice? And this is where you get into Jason Morgan saying, well, you have to cancel Clarence Thomas and you have to cancel Booker T. Washington. You have to cancel these people because, of course, they don't always fit into the leftist narrative. So if you pick an African-American who's not fit the narrative, well, then you can't use them. They're not really part of the narrative and they can't be selected at all. So I like this piece because he does say, look, I have problems with Jackson. He points it out. It's a very long piece, and it's good, though. And I'll say this about James. He is supremely educated and well-read, and when you go through this, it's very academic parts of it, which I think is maybe hard for some readers to get through, but I think that it's when you can and you have time to digest it. It's why we publish it on Friday to give people a couple of days really to go through it before the next week hits. It's not one of these pieces like Morgan's piece. You read it and it's funny and it's fast, like a Louis Grizzard piece. I mean, I look at Morgan's piece in a lot of ways like Louis Grizzard. You go through it and you laugh and you think, yeah, that's hilarious. But this piece has to be consumed and digested, and it's really good that way. And we publish these pieces at the Institute because our job is educational. I think that he does a very good job presenting this, and of course, bringing other aspects of Southern society and life into this, Southern culture, Southern philosophy. It's good, and James has that background, and so that's why his pieces are written this way. But when you look at Jackson and you look at who he was, I mean, yes, there were problems with Jackson, but taking him down, tearing him down this way is counterproductive, and Southerners should be very cautious of that. Americans in general should be very cautious of that. What are we doing? This is part of, so the enemy of my enemy is my friend in this particular way, and this is cancel culture, canceling someone who was a real American hero, as I point out in my politically incorrect guide to real American heroes. He was a hero. I mean, look, without Jackson, we don't win the Battle of New Orleans, and Jackson did a lot in service of the United States, winning the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and some of the things that were important for Americans to secure the Southwest. So he was an American hero, flawed, as anybody is. Certainly as president, there were serious problems with Andrew Jackson, and I pointed that out in my 9 presidents who screwed up America. So I've got Jackson in 2 different sides, and I've talked about this conflict in the 2. Jackson, the soldier, is good. This is why he was included as that part. Actually, I counted him in a frontiersman. Jackson, the soldier, is good. Jackson, the president, is bad. And that's the real issue with Andrew Jackson. And I think, again, James does a fantastic job with that. So we had a lot of really good material this week, and this is one of the best weeks I think we've had in a long time. And so for those people that are interested in contributing to the website, I will say this: if you listen to this podcast, send me your articles. Go to the website, look at article submissions, look how to do it. We get it. We review them. You could be published on the Institute website. We'd like to get new writers. We'd like to have people that are interested in the Southern tradition, all aspects of it. Art, music, literature, history, philosophy, whatever you can come up with, just talking about important Southerners. We've done that a lot. And talk about people that were important contributors to American life and society that were Southern. Or look at the piece by Casey Chalk. It's a look at the South from a different perspective. This particular perspective being Henry James, and Southerners in literature. These are things that we like to do. Our job at the Institute is to bring you 400 years of Southern history, culture, tradition, these things that are timeless. And we do it through a variety of mediums. And I think that's the important part. That's the important role that the Abbeville Institute plays in modern American society. We know there are bad things in the Southern tradition. Every tradition has them, right? Things we don't want to emulate, things we don't want to bring back again. But the Southern tradition is a beautiful rose. We don't chop it down because it has some thorns. I've said this before. It's a rose garden. There are thorns in it, but you got these roses and they smell good, and you want to nourish them and keep them going. You don't chop it all down because you might get pricked by a thorn here and there. That's not what you do. That's not what a people do that want to preserve something that's beautiful and valuable. We explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition on a regular basis, and this is what I think this week at the Institute did. It showed the complexity of the South. It was a positive affirmation of being Southern through literature and just in general. It showed that wokeness, it really is a problem in two different ways, both at VMI and with Andrew Jackson, and that these things should be preserved. One Andrew Jackson, one Thomas J. Jackson. Both those Jacksons should be preserved. That's the important part of it. So, until next time,